Hey, Candace.
Hello. If I'm on here twice, I'm sorry. I couldn't get it on my computer, so I tried it on my phone. So I apologize.
No, I just see you once. I think you're fine.
Okay.
In fact, just you and me right now.
Alrighty.
We're still a minute out. So how's your semester starting off?
So far so good. Uh I went back to special ed setting, and so that's kind of taken some getting used to, but
And which district are you in?
in Glen Rose.
Glen Rose. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Got more people coming on now. Good. There's Meredith and Aaron. Denitra coming on. Yep, so far. Just starting. Give about one more minute and then we'll get started. We've got a lot to do, and I think we've only got 40 minutes before this thing's going to kick us off. So we'll see. Hey, Carrie. All right, I've got a couple of minutes after 7, so we'll go ahead and jump in. I want to talk briefly about the syllabus and then talk about our first unit and then talk about what we're going to do till we get Canvas going. Um, I've been down there yesterday and today, and I just can't figure out what the problem is. So it's really frustrating. Um, but hopefully everybody's hanging in there and nobody's getting too worried about everything. And we will go from there. So let me share my screen. There we go. All right, we'll just take a look here at the syllabus quickly. I don't have an office, so I don't have really office hours, but I'm available whenever you need me. Much of the reason that we were in Stephenville the last couple of days is that my wife is retired as of tomorrow. So we were cleaning out her office and all that fun stuff. And so we're both got some time on our hands. So if you need me anytime, I'll be glad to set up a time to meet with you, or either phone or Zoom, or come to you, or whatever we need to do. So don't feel like you're out there on your own. We'll get through this thing. We're to talk about law, and especially how it applies to the special education environment. So some of the laws we talk about will be very specific to special ed. Others we'll talk about will relate to all areas of education. And tonight's kind of an overview of how that whole legal system works. I'm not going to read through all these learning outcomes, all that stuff. Y'all can read fine, I'm sure. All that good stuff that they say we have to have, so it's in there. This is about the webinars, which obviously y'all know about because you're here. All right, this says week one that we're going to overview the legal system, legal research, and do an introduction to special ed law. I think we'll get that done today. Each week, you're going to have a mini quiz about key legal cases and the holdings of these key cases. Most of this information is in your textbook, and most of the court cases that we'll be quizzing over, we'll discuss in the webinars. Again, the webinars are optional. This is not a necessary thing for an online class. Just Lisa and I have found that, Dr. Lisa, excuse me, and I have found that students that attend the webinars get a lot more information, do much better on the quizzes and all that kind of thing, make better grades overall. Could argue, well, the students that are bothering to do this are the good students anyway, so it may not be because of the webinar at all. It may just be that y'all are wonderful, and we could go with that as well. So, but I'm still trying to decide how we're going to do a quiz this week if we don't get Canvas. So we'll cross that bridge later. I'm definitely not going to make anything due till after the Labor Day holiday, or on the Labor Day holiday night. I would usually do it on Sunday, but that's crazy since we haven't had any class, and we may not just have anything due at all this week and just move on from there. There are also going to be some individual and sometimes small group weekly activities that y'all will do to help learn this material. And there'll be a final exam, and the last part will be the professionalism grade that I will assign based on your professionalism and your communication and your attendance and all that kind of good stuff. So here's the general parts about the professional behavior expectations. I am an old behavior teacher. I taught special ed for many years with kids with emotional and behavioral disorders. So I do believe in setting expectations. I was also a school principal, and I know that I taught my teachers, if you will set your expectations early on, the students, a lot of them will rise to them. And if you haven't set your expectations, then don't be surprised if the kids are doing whatever they want to do because you haven't told them anything otherwise. So expectations are spelled out here as to what we need to be doing. More stuff from the university. I guess y'all caught the artificial intelligence blurb we have to put in there now. Not sure how that applies yet, but whatever. Any questions on any of this, just feel free to ask. You probably have seen this kind of junk a million times. All right, how to get a hold of me. I guess my email at Tarleton will be back up at some point. And I guess it will be the same. When I asked that question yesterday, they couldn't tell me for sure. But if it's different than that, I'll let you know. Plus, by now, y'all all have one of my other emails, and I got a bunch of them. So just any of them, I check them all. But if you really need something quick, send me a text or give me a call in case I'm not around my email. We've already talked about how I'll get back with you and as soon as I can, and we'll get you through this. How long will it take before you get a response, and how long will it take to grade assignments? How many of you have had my wife for class? All of you. Okay. I grade papers faster than Lisa. Okay. In fact, oftentimes I grade papers for Lisa. So she just really doesn't like that whole grading thing. So anyway, you should get them back in a fairly reasonable amount of, oh, she's giving me the stink eye over there. You should get them back in the reasonable amount of time. If you're worried about something, just let me know and we'll get it done. Any questions on the syllabus at all before we jump into the rest of it? Y'all are easy. Okay. That's the wrong one. One. Oh, yellow went away. Okay, are you seeing that? Seeing the PowerPoint? All right, so we're looking at chapter 1 through 3 today. American legal system is based on a system called federalism, where the federal government has the ultimate power. And our main source of law, of course, is the U.S. Constitution. This is our basic source of law. But then there are other constitutions, like Texas has its own constitution that applies to us. So those are our actual sources of law. And there are some constitutional principles that go with that. The 10th Amendment says that the federal government has only the powers that are granted to it by the Constitution. Now, if you look at the powers that are granted to the to the federal government, education is not listed as one of those rights, and therefore it is reserved to the state. However, since about the 1970s, actually started a little bit before that in the 60s, but especially since the 70s, there has been a lot of federal government involvement in local schools. You're all aware of federal monies that come to the school district. What you're probably not aware of is how little money that actually is. Districts might be wise to look at not taking the federal money and seeing which of the laws they wouldn't have to comply with if they did that. But the government has figured out how to make it pretty sticky, where you could get sued because the people have rights, even if you're not accepting the federal dollars, which in most districts is about 4% of the monies that they get. So one of the things we're going to look at a little bit is, how did the federal government end up so deeply involved in education? We all know about the Department of Education, and we know about our fear of that in the local schools. But the states are supposed to have all the powers that are not expressly given to the federal government in the Constitution. But somehow we've gotten away from that in education. So source of law include the foundation, the Constitution, but then statutes. And statutes are laws that are passed. And then regulations are the rules that go give us guidance for those laws. And then we have court cases. So the Constitution, and then the next part is called legislation. The last part there is we call litigation. That's the court cases and what we end up calling case law that comes out of those. So if we take a look at it, remember we have the three branches. The legislative is supposed to create laws. The executive branch is supposed to enforce laws. And the judicial branch of the government is supposed to interpret laws. The Supreme Court, when it's swinging to the liberal side, is often accused of creating law from the bench, they call it, where they take a broad interpretation of the Constitution and say, well, they think that the writers of the Constitution meant to say this, that it should apply to that. So they interpret it very broadly, where when we have a conservative Supreme Court going on, they usually stick very closely to the Constitution. And if it's not in there, they don't say that it is a right. They don't say that it's a part of the law. So they try not to make laws from the bench. They try to keep it more closely aligned to what the Constitution says. Now, if you're old like me, which you're not, but you start realizing that the guys that set up our government, the forefathers, were pretty smart guys. And they realized that there are going to be swings. So you can have a very conservative president, as we did in Trump, and then a very liberal or progressive president, as we do now. But things don't really change that much for the average person. Yeah, we're paying more for gas, and some other things are not quite like we'd like it, but other people think, well, this part's better or that part's better. But they're balanced out with this set of checks and balances, because when the conservative president was in there, he put conservative people on the court. So when the liberals take the White House, take the take the executive branch, then they're kind of hampered in what they can do by the Supreme Court. And then when it swings back the other way, because the liberals are in power, they will put people on the court who are more liberal. Then when it swings back the other way, and the executive branch is conservative again, then the Supreme Court will be more liberal. So everything kind of tends to balance out. Not a whole lot here, it's going to be quizzed on, stuff that you've known, but it's all going to play into what we look at. Statutes are laws that are written by the federal or state legislature and then signed into law by the president or the governor. What's our major law in special education? I think people are talking, but they're muted. Anybody? Somebody say something? I didn't hear anybody. How about IDEA? You familiar with that one? All right. It's Public Law 94-142. It was signed into law by a guy named Gerald Ford. I remember him, president after Nixon. And when he signed it into law, he said, I'm signing this because it's the right thing to do, but we can't afford it. And the government from this time forward has continued to expand IDEA, PL 94-142, which at the time that it was enacted was called the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. And as we talked about earlier, they have never paid near enough. So the burden has fallen to states and local, but it is a law that must be followed. And that's how laws work. If you're forgotten about any of this, go back to the Schoolhouse Rock, and they've got really good things about the bill and sitting on the Capitol Hill, waiting to be signed. So it's good refresher. Statutes are generally policy frameworks. They don't often get down into the nitty gritty, get in the weeds. You're not going to go and find a statute that will tell you, how to run an ARD meeting. By the way, y'all know ARD is a Texas term, right? The rest of the world calls these IEP meetings. So when you're out there in some international conference and you say, well, I had an ARD the other day, people are going to say, you what? You talk about going to art meetings, they're like, oh, art meetings, what do y'all talk about? You like visual arts or music? Or no, it's not art, it's art, but it is a great word. It can be an adjective because you have an ARD meeting. It can be a verb. We ARDed a kid the other day. Or you could just have it a noun. I went to an ARD. So it's a great word. Just understand the rest of the world doesn't speak Texan. State laws may go beyond federal laws, but they can't conflict with federal laws. Now, the regulations, when the legislature gives a law, they then write regulations. Sometimes we call these the rules and regs. And this is what will help teach you how to implement what's going on. So a lot of times what we look at more than the law itself are the rules and the regs that are given out, because they add detail. And then often they will write guidelines. And guidelines is another one of those things that can swing tremendously on depending on who's in power. Many of the guidelines that were handed down under Obama were, 30-page documents that you were expected to follow. Now, the law doesn't say you have to follow it, and you really couldn't get in trouble if you didn't. But, when you get something from the Department of Ed, then you feel like this is something important. So guidelines can be very confusing as well. When it comes to the Department of Education and the special ed, there's two areas that we look at. One is both fall under the purview of the OSERS, the Office of Special Education Rehabilitative Services. One is OSEP, that's the Office of Special Education Programs, and then the other is the Office of Civil Rights. So we have to balance those at all times as we're working with it. Now, case law is the other type of law. This comes from court cases and from judges where they have given an interpretation to a statute or a regulation, and then they compare that with what the Constitution says to come up with an opinion. Legal systems depend on these decisions and the precedents that they will establish. There's this Latin stare decisis, which means let the decision stand, which is a precedence kind of thing. We don't want all the states going around willy-nilly deciding whatever they want to. So courts try to stick with the precedents that have been set and make their decisions in order with that. The federal court system, we all know about the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, we all know about that. That's the big one. But under that, you have the United States Court of Appeals. There are 13 circuit courts in that have different regions they're responsible for. And then there are federal district courts, which are less powerful than those, but all of that is still part of the federal court system. So you have your district courts that then feed into the courts of appeals, and then that goes up to the United States Supreme Court. So no cases start with the Supreme Court. They all start down with the district courts. And then if they don't get a decision they like, it'll be appealed to the courts of appeals. And then if there are some courts that are varying their opinions from others, then eventually the Supreme Court will take it and they will set a precedent that applies to everybody. So when the court acts as an interpreter of the U.S. Constitution, it's virtually supreme. What they say pretty much goes. But they have limited power when it comes to legislation that's been enacted, because they will make the legislative will make a law, the judicial will make a decision on that saying this law is not good or not fair or not right. And then the legislation will come back and they will change the law or make another law. So there's limited power on both sides in those cases. Kind of a vertical here. It starts at the bottom. You go to a trial. If you don't like it, you appeal it to an intermediate court, and then eventually it'll go to a court of last resort. So there's a Supreme Court in Texas. There's a Supreme Court of the United States. So depending on whether you're going with the state laws or federal laws, that's how it works. And here's our boundaries. Say that 5 with Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. We are in the Fifth Circuit. So if you ever hear a decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, that applies to us. The Fifth Circuit has traditionally been a very conservative court. that tries to keep things, close to the Constitution. The Ninth Circuit, way out there with a lot of states, including California, has been a very liberal court. And many times the cases that are decided by the Fifth Court and the Ninth Court don't agree. So here's your question. If a case is decided by the Ninth Court, by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, does that apply in Texas?
No, it does not.
You're right. It does not. So sometime we hear about some crazy decision that they've made in the Ninth Circuit, and really we don't have to worry about it. And eventually, if the Ninth Circuit decides one way on something, the Fifth Circuit decides another way on it, the Supreme Court can agree to hear that, and then they will make a precedent for the entire country. Doesn't matter. All right, so the way this sometimes works, we talked the book has the Park case and the Mills case. Park is the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Citizens, and Mills was basically a foster kid in the DC area. These both came out of 1972. In the Park case, it was decided that a student who was mentally retarded, and I know the new term is intellectual disability. It's not even a new term anymore. It's been there a while, but back then they had mental retardation. So the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Citizens said, even a person who is mentally retarded should be able to go to school. And the school said, no, it's too expensive. We can't do that. All we'd be doing is babysitting, and that's not what we're here for. Well, the court ruled that under law, everybody gets to go to school. Now, they were basing a lot of that on Brown versus Board of Education, which had to do with race, and said that everybody deserved an equal opportunity for education. And so they took that and said, well, if, black kids and white kids all deserve to be educated, then kids with disabilities deserve to be educated. And Mills took that a little bit further, because they said not just people with retardation, but people with other disabilities. That was in 1972. Then in 1975, the legislature came out with the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. This is PL 94142, what has become IDEA, and that's the law of the land. And that's where the court decided, and then legislation came in and made a law that agreed with that and stood up what the court was saying. Now you take it a little further, 10 years down the road, and you have the Smith versus Robinson case, which basically says that the people who end up going to court to get their kids the education they deserve should be able to get their attorney's fees covered. And the judge ruled that, yes, they should be able to. And I think it's Robinson said, no, they shouldn't. That's just a bunch of money on that it's going to cost the schools, and we don't need that. So a couple of years later, law came in called the Handicapped Children's Protection Act in 1986 that said, yes, definitely attorney fees will be covered if you go to court under the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. So legislation and litigation often work together in those types of ways. Legal research, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I think it's pretty well self-explanatory, but it is going to help you know how to cite your resources whenever you're writing paper in APA style. This is a United States code, and you put the section number, the subsection number, which title it is. You've heard of Title IX. You've heard of some of these different titles that are out there, and that's what it's talking about. Title IX is the decision or a statute made by the Ninth U.S. Supreme Court. Goodness, I can't talk. United States Code, rather, and then you can have the different sections where you find what you need. These are just some resources for you. They have a lot of those in there. If you have one that says CFR, that's the Annual Code of Federal Regulations, while the Federal Register, the FR, is something that comes out daily, and it doesn't hold as much weight. So there's an example of a CFR. Again, more sources for you. So primary sources when you're doing research in law include federal case law and state case law. And there are different reports out there that are available on the websites that can help you find these that apply. These are the different abbreviations that they're giving you. Most of that's not going to. So here's a case, Daniel R.R. versus Board of Education. This is a case that we will learn about this year, and you can see who decided it, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, it hasn't gone beyond that at this point, so it applies to us because we're in the Fifth Circuit. It does not apply in California. However, most states tend to go with these court cases and will make laws that work within those. Lots of places out there to find court opinions. The opinion is usually the opinion of the number of justices who supported or defeated it, and then you'll have a dissenting opinion, which will be the ones who voted against that. Secondary sources are legal dictionaries, legal encyclopedias. You can find much of this stuff on the internet. Oh, speaking of sources, I think there's some confusion a little bit on, and I probably should have changed this a little bit on the syllabus, but the only book you have to have is the Mitchell book. You don't have to buy the APA manual. It can help, but all that stuff's on the internet. You can Google APA on how to do anything, and it's out there. So don't spend money on that unless you're going to be doing it a whole bunch. And, you know, if you're going to go for a doctorate and all that, it might be worth having, but it's too expensive. Don't mess with it. All right. We will do some legal research as we go through, but don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. So education in the United States. For a long time, you could send your kids to school if you wanted to. In fact, the original schools in the United States were made for the purpose of teaching students to read the Bible. Sounds kind of funny now. One of the earliest laws was in Massachusetts, and it's called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And the reason it's called that is because there was a line in this that said, because we want our students to be able to not be tricked by that old deluder Satan, we want them to learn how to read the Bible. So that was the purpose of schools when they first started in the United States. Now, of course, that was early on, and you know, Harvard, Yale, many of those schools began as preacher schools. Hard to believe that now, but that's how they started out. And eventually you could send your kids if you wanted. You didn't have to. But finally, there was some court cases that came about that required compulsory attendance. However, students with disabilities were excluded. Parental advocacy groups came along and said, well, we need to get into bigger advocacy groups, and we need to start changing some of these things. We've talked about Brown versus Board of Education. This said that the legal term was that separate is inherently not equal. What they're doing is they're turning around a court case from the 1800s where blacks had their own separate rail cars from the whites. So if they wanted to ride the trains, the blacks could not ride in the same train as the train car as the whites. And typically the cars for the white people were plush and they had velvet seats and cushions and all that, while the rail cars for the black people would have just wooden benches for them to sit on. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled, as long as everybody has the same type of car, then it's fine to keep the blacks segregated from the whites. So that came up with the precedent of separate but equal, that it was okay, it's okay to keep everybody separate as long as everybody was treated equally with what they had, with the amenities that they had. Now, Brown versus Board of Education basically reversed that, and they said, no, separate is inherently not equal. It's pretty clear that the schools that we have for black kids are using leftover textbooks that aren't any good anymore. If they even have books, they're not furnished as well, you know. So separate is inherently not equal. Now, I understand that was about race, but as we opened up for blacks and whites to be educated together, then why not open up for people of different abilities to be educated together? And so all of this special education law built out of the civil rights movement. We've talked about Park, we've talked about Mills versus Board, federal involvement. Early on, the federal government got involved with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. That was signed into law by LBJ here in Texas. And this is where the federal government first dipped its toe into education. Then in 1970, the Education for Handicapped Act, you've all hear about Section 504. Section 504 is Section 504. Remember, we saw that little section sign in some of our law? It's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So when we talk about Section 504, it's more laws for people with disabilities. Then they had the amendments in 74, and then finally the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 75. We talked about the Handicapped Children's Protection Act that got the fees, lawyers' fees, and then there were some amendments that furthered that. Then the Education for All Handicapped Children Act became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was reauthorized in 1990 and said at that point it would be reauthorized every 5 years. So it was reauthorized in 1990. It was then reauthorized in 97, and then it was reauthorized in 2004, and it has not been reauthorized since. So we are still operating under that law that should have been reauthorized 3 times since then and has not been. So a lot of the changes that we're seeing, like if you're a diagnostician, you know, there've been a lot of changes even this year on this languages other than English and those sorts of things. Those are not part of IDEA. They're part of rules and regulations that have changed within the framework of IDEA. Recent federal was amendments of 97. You all heard about the No Child Left Behind Act. Then we have the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education. And again, no new laws came out of this, but they had the IDEA Improvement Act 2004. That's the last reauthorization of it. So the big deal is that when we first started with educating people with disabilities, it was about access, getting them access into our public schools. And now it has become very much about accountability. Okay, covered that quickly, and you may have brain overload, but I wanted to leave time if anybody has any questions at the end. Are y'all hanging in there? I mean, I know this is frustrating for you as it is for me. Gonna make it. Anybody need anything? If you're one of those people that doesn't want to say it in front of anybody else, then just text me or call me and we'll work it out.
Dr. Kevin, I don't need anything, but I just want to make sure I understand. So we're just waiting for Canvas to get, have access. And then after that, we'll be able to go from there as far as deadlines and assignments.
Yeah, if I don't have it by the weekend, I think I'm going to go ahead and send an email assignment because, we only have 8 weeks and we've blown a week at this point. Uh, started a week ago yesterday. So we've got to do something. And so probably if I don't have access by the weekend, I'll email assignments and we'll figure out a way to make that happen.
Thank you.
Anybody else? None of y'all are panicking. Good. All right. Well, thank y'all for being here. It makes it so much easier to do this when you're not talking to a blank screen. So we look forward to a good 8 weeks or 7. If you need anything, give me a holler.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Y'all too.